Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us. This is our first lesson on Sunday evening for the month of May, and I'm excited to bring to you another lesson from Hebrews chapter 11. And today we're just going to look at one verse, and last week we looked at several verses, 11, I believe, around about. Today we're just going to look at the 20th verse, and then we're going to, next week, Lord willing, we're going to look at verse 21, and only part of 21, and then we're going to look at verse 22 the week after that. So the next few weeks we're going to go pretty slow. It's going to be like molasses, I guess you could say, through Hebrews 11, because we're just going to look at the next three verses in the next few weeks, and then we'll cut into a large section of it towards the end of May. But today we're going to look at Isaac, and verse 20 of Hebrews chapter 11, we see that phrase once again, like we've seen every time so far, as the author of Hebrews brings in another person, this cloud of witnesses, as he calls them in the first verse of chapter 12. Whenever he brings in that new person that's illustrating the point that he made, he says, by faith. And that, of course, as we've done every time so far, that brings us back to Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 1, which therefore defines what faith actually is. Don't let the world define what faith is. Don't let Webster's define what faith is. Let God define what faith is. And he defines it this way: faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. And therefore, by faith, and that faith is what pleases God, that faith that he defines in verse 1, and without faith it is impossible to please him, for whoever would draw near to God must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who seek him, the English Standard Version says. And so it's by that faith that all these people please God, and how their faith is manifested in their life is the subject of Hebrews 11, and therefore that gives us spiritual application today for each individual Christian. And so by faith, he says in verse 20, Isaac invoked future blessings on Jacob and Esau. Now, a lot of what we already see about Isaac has been covered in Abraham. And today, I don't expect today's lesson to be incredibly long. The last few weeks have been over 20 minutes, over 25 minutes actually. I don't expect it to be that long today, because we're just going to cover a little bit about Isaac. Isaac, we don't have a lot of information about Isaac. In fact, when you consider all of the original patriarchs of Israel, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, we have a great deal of information about Abraham. We have a great deal of information, probably even more to a degree, about Jacob. But when it comes to the one in the middle there, Isaac, the son of Abraham, the father of Jacob, there's just not a lot of information to go on. There is some, but it's usually connected to his father, or it's connected to his sons, and the rest of it is hard to come by. But what we do come by is very compelling. Now, again, a lot of the information that we have about Isaac is parallel to Abraham. In fact, it runs so parallel in some cases that some people that are critics of the Bible, and when I say critic, I don't mean someone that criticizes the Bible. That's a different thing. It's someone who has really studied it and to great detail. I don't usually agree with them, however, when it comes to that. But it doesn't mean that they're criticizing the Bible at all. It's just someone who has studied deeply, and usually they're not. Usually they may not have a slant towards biblical Christianity at all, so you have to really be careful listening to what they have to say. They are there, and they oftentimes lead people, unfortunately, they oftentimes lead people astray. Not always, but oftentimes they lead people away from the Bible. And when you look at Isaac, the accounts of Isaac's life, there's some parallels there between Isaac and Abraham, that these critics have come up with the idea that Isaac's story just didn't happen, and someone got confused and wrote down Isaac's story, or Abraham's story, an abbreviated version of Abraham's story, and assigned it to Isaac. There's a lot of problems with that, obviously, but that's what a lot of these critics have taught, and sometimes you'll hear that on secular campuses when you have classes about theology and things like that. And two of the instances that come to mind with Isaac paralleling his life, paralleling his father's, is that we remember Abraham obviously lied about Sarah, saying that she was his sister when they came to Egypt, and then many years later, only less than a year or just around a year from the birth of Isaac, he lied to the Pharisees in the same way, because he had feared that because of her beauty that the Egyptians, and then later Abimelech, the king of the Pharisees, not the Pharisees, I'm sorry, Philistines, king of the Philistines, would want to marry her, or at least put her in the harem and kill Abraham. And so she would lie at least twice. We have a count of twice, but we are told that whenever this happened, that they had the agreement that Sarah would lie and say that she was his sister. Isaac does the same thing, which is interesting because Isaac was not alive when this happened, as far as we know. But likely his father told him, or his mother told him, and he does the same thing with the Pharisees that Abraham, his father, had done with both the Egyptians and the Pharisees. Lies about his wife Rebecca, as saying that she is his sister rather than his wife. Another instance is a situation with the wells, with the Philistines. Abraham had a similar situation. Isaac had that situation. So a lot of people, they don't even talk about. All of these critics, they just say, well, that didn't actually happen with Isaac. It was actually Abraham. Someone got confused saying it was Isaac. I don't understand, to be honest, how folks will go that route. There's a lot of problems with that. For one thing, we have this author of a book, and then, and even if you took the route that so many people have taken, say that Moses didn't write Genesis, that there were several people who wrote Genesis, why would they contradict themselves if that was their point? Why would they do that from Abraham and then Isaac and things like that? That doesn't make any sense. Lots of things with that theory don't make any sense. What does make sense is what we actually have in the Bible, in that people's lives parallel one another's, especially fathers and sons. Their lives will parallel one another, and we see why this would happen. For one thing, a son, and a daughter too, I suppose, but a son will make many of the same decisions that his father makes. And the reason for that is because a son is raised by his father. And so we have that in our world. We talk about cycles, family cycles, and sometimes those family cycles are good, sometimes those family cycles are not good, and they need to be broken. This is not a phenomenon that is unique to our culture and time. This is a phenomenon that is universal among humanity, no matter what culture, what time period you're living in, what country you're living in. Sons will often do the same thing that, or something similar that their fathers did. It's what they know. It's what they've been taught. So I don't know why anybody would have a problem thinking that Isaac would make a similar mistake that his father Abraham made. When it comes to the situation of the wells that you can read about in Genesis between Abraham, and then later you have a similar situation with Isaac and the Philistines. They live in the same place. How many times have nations had similar situations from generation to generation because things are constantly being debated and fought over? Why would that be any different in an area that is arid and dry and people are fighting over water? Same thing or something similar happened with Isaac as it did with Abraham. So if you ever hear, and you may not, you may read it in a commentary, or you may not, if you ever hear things like that, just remember that that is someone's opinion that is slanted against divine inspiration of the Scriptures, and they're just looking for anything they can to try to weaken someone's faith or belief in the Scriptures as the inspired Word of God. There are folks that would attack me for saying that, even folks within Christian communities that would attack me for saying that, but honestly, I can't see any other reason why they would. But we're going to get to Isaac here and what it says about Isaac in the next 10 to 15 minutes, about what is going on here in Hebrews chapter 11. It says, by faith Isaac invoked future blessings on Jacob and Esau. All right, so Isaac has two children. It is interesting that Abraham, he has a few boys, but he has one through Hagar, and we're not going to go back and talk about that again. There are lessons on the YouTube channel that talk about that from back in last summer of 2020. You can go back and research that. He has another concubine that we don't know much about by the name of Keturah, and he has several sons by her. And then, of course, he has Isaac, one son through his wife. He has concubines, but he only has one wife, and of course that's Sarah. Now, Isaac himself and his wife Rebekah only have two sons, and that through they were twins, and so there was really only one pregnancy between Isaac and Rebekah. Rebekah had a hard time getting pregnant. In fact, we understand that she could not, just as Sarah was old and she was unable to have children. There's a lot of things that go into that, especially in that culture. The ancient Hebrew word for someone who was unable to have children was is translated literally unrooted. So it was a thing that brought shame and disgrace upon a woman if she couldn't have children in that time period and culture. And Sarah could not, and what we need to understand is that was God dealing with that situation. It was a miraculous birth. Same thing with Rebekah. There was no other pregnancy. She had been barren, unrooted, as the Hebrew word would say, something that caused her great sorrow and grief, and it was of God. Now, Jacob and his wives and concubines will have 13 children altogether, 12 sons. But the first two patriarchs only have a limited amount of children. Abraham to Sarah with one, and Isaac to with Rebekah two, and that was with twins. Now, we know the story of Jacob and Esau. We're not going to get into that, but he says he invokes future blessings on Jacob and Esau. Jacob will become the father of the nation Israel. And of course, Esau will become the father of the nation Edom. Both of them are going to become very powerful nations in the region. But he invokes these blessings by being faithful to God and faithful to his father. And the thing that I want us to really focus on is Isaac's part in the sacrifice that Abraham is commanded to make. And then, of course, you can read about Isaac later on and how he favored Esau, and really how they had a dysfunctional family. Isaac and Rebekah had a dysfunctional family between the four of them. But Isaac was a good father, and he did love both Esau and Jacob, just as Rebekah loved both Esau and Jacob, and that's very obvious as we look at their family dynamic in those few chapters that we have anything about them. But what we see with Isaac is so many people have this image, this artistic image in their mind of Isaac being a little boy when Abraham takes him up into Mount Moriah, which later we know would be that most people believe it to be the Temple Mount that Solomon would build a temple on, and sacrifice him. Most people have this idea that he was a little boy, and that Abraham was taking him unwillingly to the sacrifice. And that's just not the case at all. Now, we don't know exactly how old Isaac was. A lot of folks would like to put him in his 30s. I suppose that is possible. I don't know exactly how we would do the math. I'm not sure the math is actually, there's not enough information in the passage leading up to the sacrifice of Isaac to give us a clear indication of how old he was. But we can come away with the understanding that he was an adult, certainly in his late teens, and old enough to know what was going on eventually. And as he climbs that mountain, you go back to Genesis and you read the story. As he climbs the mountain with his father, he's carrying the wood that was for the sacrifice. So we know that he wasn't a young boy. A young boy's not going to be able to carry that wood. He was intelligent. He had seen his father sacrifice to God before, obviously, because he said, here's the fire, or here's the wood, here's the fire, but where's the sacrifice? And of course, Abraham said to Isaac that the Lord would provide for himself a sacrifice. And of course, that he had not told Isaac what would happen at that point, but he begins to bind Isaac up. Now, Abraham's an old man, very old at this point. Remember, he was 100 years old when he was born, about 100 years old when Isaac was born, and he fathered Isaac. So he's old. I don't know what the dynamics are there. I don't know how strong a person is who lives to be in their hundreds. And how, if a person lived to be in their hundreds, it wouldn't likely be all that strong, though I suppose it is possible that they would be somewhat strong. But certainly not as strong as someone who was much, much younger. He binds him up. That shows us that Isaac himself has faith in his father Abraham, who in turn has faith in God. And we read about that last week because God told Abraham to do this thing, and we get the image in our minds, and maybe it was this to a certain extent. We can't really tell for sure, but it doesn't seem to be carried like this in the scriptures. We get this image in our minds that Abraham just was beside himself. Why would God want me to do this? And I think there's a movie called The Bible that really only covers the first 11 chapters of Genesis. I'm sorry, first several chapters of Genesis up to these things. And he's just beside himself. Why would God want me to do this? And he wails and he mourns the death of Isaac, but that's not the story. The story is he had faith in God. The story is, as we read there, we put things together. He had full faith in God. God told him that Isaac would, through Isaac, he would eventually have nations come to him, many nations. In fact, that's what the name Abraham means. Now, there are his other sons also were the founders of other nations, but those weren't the ones that God was really concerning himself with. Even his nephew, who he raised, was the father of a couple of different nations, or at least the grandfather of a couple of different nations. God was talking about what was going to happen through Isaac, because it wasn't just the father of nations. It was that through Isaac's seed, many years later, as God said, that nation would come back, that seed would come back as a nation, and they would inherit the promised land when the sin of the current inhabitants had reached its full capacity. That's what it means. And Abraham knew that, and that was part of the promise. Another part of the promise was that eventually all the nations of earth would be blessed because of Abraham's seed. And of course, we know that to be through Christ and the coming of the church, so on and so forth. So Abraham knew all this, and Abraham knew that God was one that could be trusted. He put his full faith in God, and that's, Paul talks about that in Romans. He talks about that in Galatians. Throughout the New Testament, it points back to Abraham's faith, and in Hebrews it points to Abraham's faith. We don't see an Abraham who was wailing and mourning, or even nervous, because he believed in the promise of God so much. He put his faith in God so much that when he sacrificed Isaac, he believed that he would bring him back from the dead. That's faith that leads to obedience. Now we see the same thing in Isaac, because Isaac is not a young boy. He is a young man. His teens, probably no later than early 30s. He's able to overpower his father, and yet he submits to his father's will. He sees the faith that his father had in God, and he puts his faith not only in God, but he puts his faith in his father Abraham. He submits to him. A real faith submits. When we submit to God, we may not always understand what it is that God is doing, but we understand that God knows what is best. We see that kind of attitude in Isaac. And in doing that, he invokes future blessings on his sons, Jacob and Esau. And today, we continue on as Christians because of the promise that God first gave to Abraham in Genesis 12, and he repeats it in Genesis 15. I also believe Genesis 18 he repeats it. He also repeats it to Isaac. It's a little different, obviously, because he was the son of promise, so you don't need to have that promise, part of the promise, repeated. But then he gives it to Jacob. And then, of course, it goes down through the line until it comes to Jesus, and then all the nations of the earth are blessed through Jesus. All because this young man submitted to his father, who is submitting to God. Now, that's an important lesson as well. And we're going to close with this thought, I believe. Abraham's faith in God led Isaac to his faith in God. That doesn't always happen. God knew it would in that case. But it's very important for us to show our children that we believe. We also want to make sure that we don't try to hide our mistakes. I mean, they don't need to know everything, obviously, but if we make a mistake in their presence, let them know, I made a mistake. I'm not perfect. And then we go to God and show them that we believe in God and His grace, put our faith in Him. Show them what faith is. They'll have to accept it and make their faith their own when the time comes. Certainly we want to show them our submissive nature, and hopefully we have a submissive nature to God and His will, and that they will adopt that for themselves, knowing that God knows what is best, and that we as parents have shown that to them, and they in turn will show their children the same thing. Not everyone will be faithful to God and His promises, but many will. And today, that future blessing that Isaac invoked because of his faith in God and his obedience and submission to his father, today we have that example, and we have Jesus, and because of Jesus we have the church, and we have salvation, and we have the kingdom, which was God's plan all along. So we want to encourage one another. Put your faith in God. Submit to His will. And show others that that's the kind of life that you have chosen, and that it's open and offered to everyone. Thank you all very much for listening in this evening. Next week we're going to talk about Jacob, I believe. We're not going to get into Esau. We're going to talk about Jacob for a little bit. And just that section that the author of Hebrews talks about there, which is found at the end of Genesis. We're not going to get into the whole life of Jacob, but just what Hebrews talks about, and then we'll talk about Joseph on May 16th, Lord willing. Well, thank you all very much again, and I hope you have a great week, and stay safe, stay well, and just keep on keeping on, and keep the faith. I love you all, and God bless, and bye-bye.